Hello and welcome to the Lyon Show. It's your host, your favorite business coach, Robert Lyon. Today, I have the great privilege of talking to Sebastian Garcia. So I'm just going to give a little of an introduction. This guy is our lawyer for our company, and he's amazing. He does just such great work. We've talked to each other for a long time. We actually met back in Scaling with Systems. But Sebastian, why don't you just kind of introduce yourself a little bit and tell everybody kind of what you're up to and what you do?
For sure, will do. Well, thanks for having me on here, Robert. Really appreciate it. A little about me. So, I have been in business for myself as an attorney now for a little bit over a year. Aside from all the schooling and working for various law firms, and I worked for a judge for a little bit. So that was definitely a good foundation. But when I was kind of like coming up, so to speak, and getting exposure to a lot of different areas of law. One thing that really resonated with me was a case that I worked on regarding litigation between, a founder of a business that had scaled pretty large, and then some investors that were trying to come in. And if any of you have read the Elon Musk book, you're probably familiar with corporate takeovers, where investors will come in and try to boot the founders and
Oh,
put in
wow.
all the Wall Street money and make the business not as exciting as when it was a startup. So that really kind of ignited my passion for wanting to work, not necessarily with like large corporations, but with founders who really share that passion for innovation and growing the business rather than like that bureaucratic approach that kind of comes into a business at far later stages. So yeah, after just going through my whole experience, those jobs were very difficult to come by because typically, like a founder-led business is not going to work with like a large corporate law firm. So I was kind of just left with the fork in the road to be like, well, do I want to work for a larger corporation, doing legal work that I'm probably not that interested in, or do I want to go this other route and try to stake a name for myself and do exactly what it is that I want to do? So that's really what brings me to where I'm at now. So if I had to encapsulate my business in a few sentences, it's outsourced general counsel for founder-led businesses and startups. That's contracts, contract reviews, compliance, employee onboarding, dealing with investors, basically anything you could think about in your business. You're like, would love to talk to a lawyer about this. That's what I do.
I love it, man. And let's bring me back to like the very beginning. What kind of made you want to be a lawyer? Were you peer pressured, or was it just something you always wanted to do, or was it just like lawyers make money? Like what kind of triggered your fascination with law and getting into it?
Yeah, so when I was in college, kind of classic. I mean, not the sexiest response, but I was like, I don't like math. I feel like my brain is a little more geared towards this. I knew I kind of wanted to like stay in school for a while, and
Yeah.
pursue like that sort of degree. So when I was in college, initially I was like, okay, well, I think law school is the path for me. And then kind of interesting, I was a bodybuilder at the time, and I ended up like starting a little business online. It was like a training business at the time. I was 19 years old. I'd
Hmm.
competed in a couple competitions. And I think at this point I was like in my second year of college. And so I was like, you know what? I actually think I really want to be an entrepreneur because this is really cool. I like social media. I like this idea of starting and growing a business. And so then at that point, I had the crossroads of like, well, do I want to keep pursuing this law thing because I know it's obviously like a very corporate path, or do I want to do entrepreneurship? And at that moment, I was like, I can probably find a way that law as a service can also create like an entrepreneurial adventure for me. So I
Yeah.
think that's what kind of led me to be like, you know what, I'll keep pursuing this. I think it makes sense.
So basically, you were a bodybuilder. I didn't know that at all, or you were doing that. And then, how long was law school? What law school did you go to? Like, I just want to live vicariously through you because I've never
Yeah.
been to law school. What was it like? Was it drooling? Was it painful? Was it interesting? What was it like?
So I went to University of Miami, so that makes it a little bit better,
Yeah.
having to go to law school. I mean, the first year is really tough because I think a lot of it is designed to be more of a weed out process. So if you ever heard of like the Socratic method, it's when the students they get called on in the middle of the class. You have a classroom of like 50 kids, and they'll just say, Sebastian, what happened in this case? And
Hmm.
you have to stand up and you have to recite the case, and then once you've done that they keep asking you questions like, so what would have happened if instead of tripping over the toy truck that was on the ground, they had actually slipped on a banana peel that was 5 feet further down the road, what would
Yeah.
be the implication of that? So that's a lot of what the first year of law school looks like. It's a lot of
Yeah.
theory. And then once you make it out that first year, then you start to take the classes that you're a little bit more interested in.
Mhm.
And the stakes definitely go down for sure.
And then, I mean, isn't it a lot of just reading like really giant textbooks about all the different words and laws and stuff like that? Like, how'd you get through that? Was that something you were all right with, or what was it just like you kind of
Yeah.
figured it out?
So that's definitely like the what everyone thinks it is. Like, okay, I'm gonna have to read, 40 to 100 pages every day. And
Hmm.
initially that's how I went into it. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna, read as much, like read all the assigned readings. It's 100 pages a day. After a couple of weeks, I was like, you know what? I don't think this is A, it's not really sustainable. And B, I was like, I'm not really retaining this because I'm reading like 100 pages of basically archaic language, trying to
Yeah.
determine what I'm supposed to get from this.
Hmm.
And then you also spend just as much time reading as you do actually like outlining it and getting your notes together. So what I actually switched to was I switched to all just commercial outlines.
Oh,
So instead of reading and trying to understand what I was supposed to get from this, I just started studying the outlines. Now I felt like I started doing that too late. And I did well in law school, but I was definitely not at the top of my class. But if I were to recommend something to anybody, it would probably be not to like waste your time reading 100 pages and not knowing what's going on, but to just go to those outlines and just hammer the rules. Because when it comes time to the exam, that's what you have to actually know. You have to know just there's 50 cases we studied this semester. What was like the one or two lines that I had to take away from all of them?
wow. I mean, I kind of think college is all about teaching you how to think, right? So do you think like a lawyer now constantly, like from back then, like bodybuilder to like now? You probably definitely think more like a
Yeah,
lawyer, right? And that kind of is what the purpose was. That's cool.
right.
I mean, what is it like? I always picture lawyers, standing up in court and yelling at someone on the jury or whatever. Like, I bet that's not really what it's like being a lawyer. But what's the benefits, or what do you enjoy about doing what you do now?
Yeah, so there's really two types of lawyers that like you kind of go into two camps, very generally speaking. You're
Hmm.
either a litigator or you're a transactional lawyer. So a
Right.
litigator is the person that you very stereotypically imagine dressed fancy, going to court, or nowadays going to Zoom,
Yeah.
and arguing. So that's one side. And then there's obviously like a lot of different areas of law. Like there's administrative law, there's criminal law, there's civil law, which is like what we deal with business stuff. And then on the other side, it's transactional. So
Hmm.
transactional attorneys are like what I do, working on contracts, reviewing contracts. It's a lot more like a business advisory role or like a consultant than it is like the very stereotypical idea of an attorney. And then you could even break it down even further where like you have general counsels, which is even more like what I do, where you're even more of an advisor and you're kind of like a partner in the business,
Yeah.
as opposed to if you're strictly transactional. Like, for example, a transactional attorney who works at a large law firm, all they'll do is mergers and acquisitions.
Hmm.
So Amazon is buying Whole Foods or some smaller company. The transactional attorneys will work on that deal typically pretty intensively for like 30 days, 30 to 60
Right.
days. It's a pretty intensive process, and that's all they'll do year round. They don't talk to the business owners, they don't do anything, and that's what they do in suits.
Yeah.
So in suits they do M&A.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, that's really the gist. And then in terms of like where I fall into it, most of what I do is as general counsel. I do very little. I've done one actual sale of a business transaction, but it's definitely not what I do on the day-to-day basis. And then I also do litigation as well. I obviously like the corporate counsel aspect of what I do
Yeah.
much better because I like being more of like a partner in the business.
Hmm.
But I will say about the litigation stuff, it makes me a lot more effective as an advisor because a contract is really theoretical until it's actually argued in real time. So it's
Right.
important to know like what are the practical considerations of a lawsuit. And when it comes to business owners, a lot of it is, well, how much is this going to cost me? How much can I pay to get this resolved? So being in the litigation world has put a lot more context to the practicalities of all the corporate work and the transactional based work.
Wow. I think it's interesting. So I'm gonna ask some selfish questions now. So I really want to start building more businesses and from the beginning, like build them to sell. Right. So what
Hmm.
kind of tips would you have for the business owner? Like, I mean, I've started all kinds of businesses, but if the main idea is like, hey, let's structure this correctly so that at the end of the day we can make the most money when we sell and then just like be rid of it and make a profit. I know there's so much that goes into that, but I think your greatest value is like entrepreneurs out there that are trying to start their business, right? They don't know what to do for any of the freaking paperwork. They don't know who to talk to, and they think that all lawyers are like, $10,000 for like an hour or something like that. Like, what is some things that business owners or entrepreneurs should know to get in place, just to cover their ass and to just kind of get going? Or like, how do you think about it, like setting their business up?
Yeah. So there's, and again, I'm gonna have to say the classic answer. Like, it depends. Like, if you have a couple partners, are you a solo person? Did
Right.
you set up a corporation versus a limited liability company? And there's really like, and I'll get around to actually answering the answer. But when you think about setting your business up for selling it,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of depends. Like, are you setting up more so as like a mom and pop type brick and mortar business that's like local in town, like your classic small
Let's
business, or are
let's
you
say
trying
it's
to
like
like
a
really,
online product, right? Let's go with that
yeah,
idea.
yeah. So if you're an online product and you're thinking about scaling, specifically, if you're going to scale through investment, if you're going
Mm-hmm.
to have employees that you're going to give equity instead of actually paying them, the
Mm-hmm.
best thing to do would be to set yourself up as a corporation. And typically, an investor who's going to want to invest in your business and like tag along for the ride, which is usually going to be something that could happen before you sell it, especially
Mm-hmm.
if you're talking at larger numbers. They're going to want to see that it's set up as a corporation.
Yeah.
When you think about
And
a limited liability, what are you gonna say?
I'm just ignorant. What is the corporation necessarily like? What's the difference between an LLC and a corporation? Obviously, it sounds bigger, but what is it
Yeah.
actually?
So a corporation has a lot more runway. So typically,
Mhm.
when it gets to be larger, there's going to be a board of directors. And so in a limited liability company, you can have what's the equivalent of a board of directors, which would be called the managers. But a corporation, it just allows for a lot more formality. So
Okay.
that this is the picture where like you have your quarterly board meetings and they all get together and there's an agenda of 10 things that need to be done and they need to vote typically by a majority to get things passed. But that aside, like later investors will want to see that sort of formality in place, but they'll also want to know that it's flexible to issue equity. So in a limited
Cool.
liability company, instead of having shares, you have membership interests. And so typically it's a lot more burdensome to work with the membership interest than it would be to issue equity
Oh,
or
okay.
shares.
And can
So
you
that's
start
another
as an
reason why the corporate,
LLC? Can you start as an LLC and then like become a corporation? You know
for
is
sure.
it just like more paperwork basically? Call you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you would have to do some paperwork with the state to get it converted, and it's not very difficult. But
Mhm.
when you think about like your typical startup, they're almost always set up as corporations.
Yeah.
Now that's not to say that being a limited liability company is bad at all, or that it means no one's going to buy it. But it depends on what exactly you're going for. So if you're like that classic startup, you're issuing equity, you're like, all right, we're doing our first investment round. That's always going to be a corporation. But to answer
Cool.
your question, if you're like an online business and I'm just getting started, I would actually always set up as an LLC,
Hmm.
not a corporation, because the corporation is going to come with those formalities that can be good later on for an investor, but it may not be ideal when you're first getting started.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this because somebody told me this. I don't know if it's true, right? You need to talk to a lawyer. So if you start an LLC, isn't it better to probably have two or maybe three people actually own the LLC? Because if it's just you on an LLC and something happens, almost always the judge is going to be like, obviously it's your business, it's your fault, right? Whereas if you have multiple people on the LLC, you go to court, they can't say that all three of you are in fault. So the business is probably the entity that's more likely to get in trouble. Is that kind of true?
Yeah. So it depends on the state's laws. So like
Oh,
very good, very pro liability protection states are like Wyoming, Delaware, and Nevada. And there's something that they have that's particularly important, directly related to what you're talking about. So some states will say that if you're a single member LLC and you're the only one that runs the LLC, it's actually very difficult to give you liability protection because some states will be like, look, unless you have multiple members, like how real is this business? And I know that
yeah.
sounds harsh, but That's part of the American system, is that every state is essentially has its own set of laws. Obviously, the federal law governs, but with things like business and these type of laws, it's almost always in the state, and that's why a lot of people start in Delaware. These other states that we talked about, like Delaware and Nevada, they will actually protect and uphold liability protection for single member LLCs. Now, every
Cool.
state is going to respect liability protection for multi-member, like you mentioned, when there's 2 or 3 people. But there becomes this distinction in the states, and what the state law has to say about this when it's 1 versus 3. So I would say a good rule of thumb would be to try to set up your business in these pro-friendly, pro-LLC or pro-liability protection states. And then if you're doing business in another state, you could always apply as a foreign entity.
Yeah, it's kind of random. I was watching some Rob Dyrdek podcast yesterday, or some other guy podcast, but they were saying that sadly, one of the ways that a lot of people try and get rich is they try and sue other people that are already rich, right? So what are some good ways that if you're a business owner that's actually making money, you can protect yourself the most from, people who are trying to like sue you and get paid? Obviously, if you do something wrong, you do something wrong, right? But like, what is like a corporation is probably the best way to protect yourself, and then just make sure all the paperwork is dialed in. But what else do you think of to protect yourself?
Right. No, I mean, that's a really good point, because I mean, we do live in a world where like you could sue someone and potentially make a good bit of money. So
Yeah,
I
it's
think the
crazy.
first way to think, it is, but I think the first way to think about it is that when you have a properly set up business,
Yeah.
whether it's a corporation or a limited liability company, the law actually treats a business as a person. So it's a
Mm,
distinct individual. So you have your individual assets and what you have as a person. So this is like, think about the dividends that you take out of your business over time and you
yeah.
transition them to yourself. As now what's in the business is considered to be the assets of that business until they've actually been transferred out. So what can you do to
Mm,
protect yourself? I think it's number one, you want to make sure that your businesses are properly set up. So like you have the proper paperwork, you're following the formalities. Like if you have an operating agreement, you're actually following what's in that agreement. Because if you were to get sued, the first thing that a court or a judge is going to look at is, was this business a real business, or was it just set up to protect someone from a lawsuit?
mm,
And one of the big distinctions there is this operating as a distinct entity with its own rules and formalities? And that's why a corporation is like de facto or default very protective, because like we talked about, it is more formal. But to address your question a little bit more straight on, you want to make sure that your assets are properly separated. So what
nice.
you own is yours. What's in your business is your business's. You don't want to individually hold your businesses. Like that would be a terrible idea, because now not only is your house and your car, which is presumably owned by you, assuming you have a house and a car, now your business assets are also attached to that. So when someone decides to sue, they have to obtain a judgment not only over just the business, they would have to get a judgment both over you personally and over your business. So a good way to think about it, to sum this up, is like, let's say somebody sues your business, and let's
Mhm.
assume that it's adequately running and the protections are proper and all those formalities are followed. If they get a judgment against your business because they had the claim against your business, they can only collect what's inside of your business. They
Gotcha.
can't collect what you have personally, and vice versa. So
Mm,
let's say you go to maybe this isn't the best example, but let's say you go to a bar and you had a little too much to drink and you end up getting into a fight
right.
and you hurt somebody and they sue you. Obviously, this isn't a claim against your business because it has nothing to do with your business. It would
Right.
be a claim against you personally. Now, if they were to obtain a judgment against you, they would be looking to collect against your personal assets, and theoretically, your business would be separated.
Yeah. And like the state and the country, they just want to see like, hey, this is a business, it has its own stuff and it pays its own taxes, right? I mean, that's probably at the end of the day, like all like the government really cares about mostly, right? It's like when you go to court, it's like how to keep it separate. All the paperwork is dialed in. It has it's its own thing, right? It's got its own entity. It's completely separate from the individual. And now you actually have a real business. Is that kind of to summarize? That's actually really
Right.
interesting. It's kind of wild.
Yeah. And I think another thing to say on this is like, again, that's why doing the litigation is important, because a lot
Hmm.
of the stuff that we're discussing, it's really theoretical. Like
Yeah.
you could have two judges in the same state, in the same county, that will see the same set of facts and rule a different way.
That's
So
awful. How dare
and
you?
that no, I know, but that's why I think it's always very important
Hmm.
to have your ducks in a row as best as you can, because when you do have your ducks in a row, that gives you more leverage to go to the other attorney and
Hmm.
say, look, what's your client going to spend on this? This is what I have to spend. Why did we come to some sort of resolution? If I know I'm going to have to spend, let's say, let's call it $10,000 just off the bat to get an attorney to defend me,
Hmm.
why don't you tell me what you're looking to gain? And typically that the leverage goes down as the lawsuit progresses. So like if I file a lawsuit, the first thing the defendant is going to do is they're going to try to file a motion to dismiss. And so
Hmm.
obviously the settlement amount is going to be a lot lower in the
Yeah.
beginning. But now if I get through the motion to dismiss, now that's one hurdle that I just got past. So in order for that resolution to occur, the number needs to go up a little bit.
Hmm.
And I think it's, as a business owner, this is kind of like an actionable tip, is like you really need to think about these things in a practical manner.
Yeah.
And that if you have a legal dispute or a legal issue, there's probably some monetary amount, unless we're talking about like, I think insurance litigation is a lot different,
Hmm.
because I kind of like to call it like funny money, because it's like Wall Street. Like there's just a ton of money in this
Hmm.
insurance company. And so they may be more likely to pay out to get rid of claims. And that's where you see like the car accident
Yeah.
litigation, like personal injury. That's why like you see those billboards like, we got our client $1 million. It's because a lot of the times the insurance companies will run that very precise financial calculation and just be like, look, just pay this out.
Yeah.
But in business litigation, it's a lot different, because the money actually matters a lot more, because you're having to pay for it, and so is the other side for the most part. So that
Wow.
would be my advice, is to think about it very practically in terms of, what is this claim worth? How much am I going to spend to defend it? And what can I pay right now to get rid of it?
I love that. That's like very straightforward. Very simple from, my better understanding of how everything works. That's cool. You said you worked for a judge and you did some other stuff. Have you ever been on other like weird cases? I mean, if you can talk about them or whatever that stick out in your mind.
Um, Let me try to think. I mean, honestly, like for the most part, it's always been pretty straightforward. I did work when I worked for the judge. I had it was like a federal like Title VII claim, which was pretty interesting.
Hmm.
And that gives you some insight in terms of employment claims, because typically the most common lawsuit that a larger company will get from an employee will be a Title VII, or like a discrimination or harassment type claim. So
Hmm.
that was interesting, because it gives you some insights on like, how would you defend that? What does the plaintiff need to prove to actually win? So that was good. I really do believe that like because some people have differing opinions on this. I remember I interviewed one time with a law firm, and one of the people on the interview call, they had worked for a judge, and they were like, one of my questions was, so how did working for the judge like give you good insights into what you
Hmm.
do now? And they were a transactional attorney, and they were like, oh, it actually had no bearing, or no effect. And I feel like it now, having been on both sides, I
Yeah.
feel like going through like the more litigation aspect of the practice is so important, because it you kind of need it in order to effectively advise your client,
Right.
because like what claim it could have merit, what couldn't, what it takes to resolve it. If you don't know how that like practically works out, and I feel like law school makes a really big mistake with this, because it's all
Yeah.
theory, right? But then in the real world, it's like I said, how much is this going to cost to defend? What do I have to pay to make it go away? How much are they asking for? And
Yeah.
there's like a lot of very practical considerations that are just never taught to you. So then otherwise you kind of just think this is like some pie in the sky theoretical case, which maybe it is like in government law,
Yeah.
but definitely not with businesses.
No, business is very straightforward. I remember I got drunk at some bar with some lawyer and we were talking. I was like, how do you like defend people? Like, what do you do? And he's like, well, usually there's one side and then there's the other side. And then right in the middle, there's actually with the truth about what happens in business and what happens with people. And I thought that was just so profound. I was like, yeah, you're right. Everybody has their own opinion, their own bullshit, but somewhere in the middle is actually maybe the truth. And even that is kind of smudged, but it's interesting to think about being a judge, right? Who are these people to judge is probably, they've read all the laws, they've just been there a lot. But at the end of the day, it's like their own opinion on what should happen, right? You got to see like what happens behind the closed doors and how they make decisions. I mean, I think there's been case studies I've read in like Malcolm Gladwell's books where he's like, the judge was having a shitty day, so like after 1 o'clock when they're tired, more people go to jail, and stuff like that. But what's it kind of like actually behind the doors, like making decisions? Is it tough, or what is it like?
Yeah. So what I would say to that is like, there's not a lot of certainty always in law.
Right.
And like, if someone brings a case, it's because they have a good argument. I mean, you're not going to bring a case if you don't have something compelling to say about it.
Right.
So I feel like what makes a judge's job very difficult is the fact that there is no mathematical formula like, 2 + 2 = 4, throw this out, it's wrong. There's always gray area. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the difficulty that falls on the judge. And it ultimately depends on their interpretation. Like I firmly believe that most cases that are brought, like you said, there's this side and there's this side, and both of them have good arguments and they have good reason to believe what they believe.
Yeah.
And coming to the resolution on that is very difficult because now you're dealing in the middle. You're okay. So like,
Yeah,
when
it's
you're
very close, but it could go either way.
right, exactly. And
It's wild.
sometimes you get very lucky. And for example, there was one case that I worked on that said, you know, 10 instances, and this is all case law that creates, the interpretation. 10 instances of this action meant that it was an actionable claim. And then the case that we were analyzing only had like two, right? So that's an easy place where you can say, typically courts have upheld this action when there has been 10 instances. However, here there's only been two. Therefore, this isn't a sufficient claim, or there's no genuine issue of fact. So that sometimes that works out, but a lot of time I think there's still a gray area. So the certainty is almost never there. So they have a tough job.
Well, I think I kind of want to, I mean, this has been very eye-opening. I love it, but I want to pivot a little bit more to the business side now and just talk about like what it's been like growing your own practice. And I love the fact that did all the kind of maybe the corporate world we can call it or whatever that is. And then you decided, hey, I'm going to go be an entrepreneur lawyer. I think that's really cool. And maybe it'll inspire some people. Tell us about that journey just a little bit more, I guess.
For sure. So it's definitely not something that is like instilled in us, I think, through the training. Like as a lawyer, and I think it's part of being a good lawyer. You're taught to be very risk averse.
Yeah.
I think like you're also taught to have kind of this imposter syndrome. Like you're always like, am I right? Am I not right? And I think that kind of breeds this insecurity in a lot of lawyers when it comes to the entrepreneurial side of things.
Right.
Because you're always like, well, am I effective enough to go out on my own? Maybe I just need to, work for a judge for another 5 years. And like, you kind of just never think you're good enough.
Well, and like
and
in college, did they beat you like in the head with this is the path of the lawyer? Like you're going to go to college and then you're going to go be a intern and eat shit for like 5 years, and then maybe you'll become your own practice or something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what they don't teach you. And so I'll actually share a funny story. So I was taking this one class in law school, and this partner at a really successful firm came to speak to us. And he said, guys, there's only two ways to be successful as a lawyer. Number one, you're either the best lawyer, whether it's in your area, you're the best lawyer in your state, you're the best lawyer in the country, or you're the lawyer who can bring business. And you have a far less likelihood of being the best lawyer in your area. Because I mean, if you think about it, like we said, it's not always objective. I think with criminal law, you get an opportunity to be very objective. And that's why when you hear about famous lawyers, they're almost always criminal lawyers. Because there is, I mean, I don't want to necessarily say this, but there's like, it's more of like a sport, like trial law. Like when you're like interviewing the jury, cross-examining people on the stand. It's like it's really an art form that like you're either very good at or you're not. So that's an area where you can definitely excel and be like quote unquote the best in the area. But for the most part, I think it's a lot easier to be successful as a lawyer if you can be a good lawyer. Obviously, don't be a bad one, but you also know how to run a business, how to get clients, and that's not something that's ever discussed.
Yeah. Well, they don't do that at school at all. They don't teach anybody how to like even business school. They'll teach you like all the fucking aspects of like trajectories of moving businesses and moving parts, but then they kick them out in the real world and they don't even know how to close a deal or do anything, how to start a business. It's like they know
Right.
all the big ideas and they have the pieces, but they don't actually teach you how to start your own business and be successful and do the things. So I guess, what have you learned so far about growing your business? What's been the struggles, and then what have you kind of figured out?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've learned is like all businesses are kind of the same, right? Like I think everyone's kind of looking for that, like, well, how do I get clients as this particular lawyer? When in reality, it's kind of just like I know like Hormozy is really popular right now, but I feel like he like what he says is really true for like every industry.
My
Like,
favorite thing right now is somebody said a quote. He's like, Alex Hermosi is the Taylor Swift of entrepreneurs right now.
yeah, no, I mean, and I went to his event and like
Oh, cool.
yeah, no, and it's true. It's like reach out to more people, provide value, and like genuinely network. Like
Yeah.
what I specifically do to get business is on LinkedIn, I'll just connect with other business owners and try to help them before I'm ever like, here's what my service is, here's what I charge.
Right.
And I think a lot like another thing that we're taught is, like you always have to charge for your time,
Yeah. For
never
lawyers, for
undervalue,
sure.
like never undervalue yourself. And I feel like a lot of lawyers don't have that mindset, and especially I'm actually feel like I'm lucky that I didn't work in corporate for very long, because I think over time you ingrain all of those habits,
Yeah.
and all of those belief systems, like I charge 500 an hour, how could I ever have a free consultation, or like how could I ever do this thing for free for a lead, but it's like what Hermosi says, like deliver value up front, and then the actual relationship from a paid perspective. I mean, it almost always transpires.
Yeah. I went to a business lawyer in my town here in Payson, and it's just so weird. We went into his office. He had like nothing, and then he had this old school typewriter, and he literally typed every single thing about our discussion out on the typewriter. And then he charged me a shitload of money for that hour. I was like, "Aren't you making a lot of money? Like, why don't you have a computer? Like, what is going on with this like super frugal lawyer firm that I just walked into?" It
Yeah,
was so weird, man.
yeah. Well,
It was
I
very
think
strange.
I don't know. I feel like I'm in a unique path where like I decided to do this early enough, and in the
Mhm.
beginning, you're like, I mean, I didn't start out and was like had a bunch of clients and everything's
Right.
going great. I mean, when I first started, it was like, okay, I secured like 1,000 a month in revenue. And then the next month, like, okay, now I'm at, two. And then the next month, okay, now I'm at four. And then like
Right.
over time, like you have to give yourself that buffer. And I think that a lot of people just aren't willing to do that.
No.
It's, I mean, honestly like, and I was against going the traditional path. And I can't tell you how many times when I first started, I was like, oh my gosh, like you're telling me I could just get a job tomorrow and make like, some pretty good money. But now that I'm like a year later, I'm so thankful that I just stuck it out. But the
Yeah.
beginning was tough. And I think whether you're a lawyer or just like an entrepreneur in general, I mean, we all have to go through that. And it's just part of the process. And I think one thing that in the beginning I felt like I was wasting time, like I mean, I did Facebook ads, I tried funnels, I tried all these different things,
Mhm.
and a lot of them I either broke even or I lost money on. And I just remember being like, I wasted a month or I wasted 2 months. But when you really look back at the whole year, you see how all of those things kind of compounded so that now you can make a decision in a day that's more
Mhm.
valuable than what it used to take you 30 days to realize. So
Yeah.
all that
Absolutely. I
whole
mean,
process is important.
something I'm teaching Gino is like you have to grow a business, right? It's not going to be a fucking $1 million business right away. And it's just like, and nobody talks about it either. It's like you have to grow it. You got to build the relationships. You got to see where you're going to go. And at the beginning, everybody thinks you're crazy. That's like the typical entrepreneur journey. Oh, he's going against the grain. It's not going to work, right? And you just got to keep your hat down, do the work, and get where you want to go. I guess I want to ask you this though: is like, what is the goal now? What do you envision for the big picture for your branch or your business? Like, do you want like a giant skyscraper, or is it going to be a small law firm still, and you're just going to grow it, or what do you really vision as the goal now?
Yeah. So my plan is I have the litigations. So I
Yeah.
have my first objective is I want to, it's about 50% of my revenue. So my first objective is I want to replace that entire 50% with my outsourced counsel service.
Hmm.
And then my goal is to just scale that. as far as I possibly can. I don't know that I necessarily want to hire other
Hmm.
attorneys. So I like my girlfriend, who's almost my fiance,
Hmm.
uh, like she's an attorney. So
Oh,
I
cool.
want her to work. I want her to work for me before I would hire anyone else. And so
Yeah.
I think one thing that will happen is I'll kind of see how far I can scale the business in terms of pure profit with two people.
Yeah.
And at that point, kind of be like, this is way more money than I need. What's the point of scaling? So that's kind of like the outer bounds of where I've envisioned it now. But I definitely don't have like right now hopes and aspirations of like having I feel like maybe a franchise model, like
That'd be cool.
having partners that I'm not actually like as involved with, but I more so just teach them like how they can scale this type of business. Something that let's say 500,000 to 1 million a year in profit
Hmm.
is kind of like the like a very like outer bound place you can go to before you start like decreasing your profits and trying to scale through like labor or ad spend or technology. If I were to go past that, like if I were to go past and I'm not there right now, I'm not at $1 million a year, but
Hmm.
if I were to go past that, it would have to be something that's just incredibly leverageable, whether it's
Right.
like a franchise model, maybe some sort of like licensing model. But I think the current vehicle that I'm in right now, I don't think it makes sense to scale it up from like a labor perspective and do like $5 million a year at like 20% margins.
Yeah. I mean, don't you think you could get like interns from college to come work for you now and like be your minions and you could scale it out that way
Yeah,
or something?
the only thing is like I'm still in that entrepreneurial like phase in my life where
Yeah.
I don't want to let go of any control. Like I'm like
No.
nobody can do this the way I do it. Like
Hmm.
I
That's
just
the
I'm
hardest
like
part.
afraid. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
afraid to do that right now. So I have to let go of that first, and then that would be possible. And
Well,
I
yeah,
think
I was
no,
just gonna
another
say
thing too
you do
is
good work, so you probably a good thing you stay in control because what you do is so valuable. But you going with what you were gonna say, sorry.
yeah, no, well, building off of what you just said, like I think because it is my business, like when somebody pays me, I take that very seriously. So like the thought of giving somebody like less than as good as I can possibly do service, it just like doesn't sit well with me. And so when I think about like how I want to scale the business, it's like either I'm doing everything or it's somebody who I like incredibly trust, which would be like
Hmm.
my girlfriend. Like it has to be somebody that like
Right.
I think is honestly like as good, if not better than I am.
Hmm.
Otherwise, I wouldn't feel comfortable taking that person's money. And I think that's probably like maybe a limiting belief I have right now in terms of like where I'm at in my journey, because I know some people say like if you can pay someone and they can do it 70% as good as you can, you hit a
Yeah.
home run. But I think I'm just not there yet. So maybe in like a couple years we can have this conversation again.
Right. Well, I mean, you just make the SOPs of what your standards are, and then you build the system. I think that's what we kind of learn, scaling systems is like build your little system, make it really work
Mm.
really well, and then maybe you'll be able to give a little bit to somebody else and give them a chance. And that's kind of how you can grow it into like a
Right.
franchise model or an idea. Because aren't there like different laws in different states? So that could be the reason you would maybe have a little franchise in like different states so you can cover different businesses and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. So there is actually kind of this interesting idea that you can practice in different states and don't don't take this as legal advice. You can practice as different states if you're hired on like an ongoing basis as a general counsel for that company.
Oh, cool.
So
So
it's a
that's how you
little
can do
bit
it.
different. Yeah, so because like the essence of the like for example, I don't have any litigations that are outside of the state of Florida because that's where I'm licensed.
Hmm.
Um, the essence of the general counsel is like you're an advisor, you're a partner in the business. Like you
Hmm.
talk about, how can we make this offer, better and also compliant, and how can you structure in a way that you're like you wouldn't be on the hook still, So it's yeah, it's obviously legal advice, but you're getting way more in the weeds than in the other examples I provided, where it's like, we maybe have like a status conference once a month or every couple months, and all I'm doing is just like updating you on the case or like saying, hey, you're going to have this deposition, I need to train you.
Yeah.
um, you're a lot more in the weeds, and I think the way the laws are set up is that they acknowledge that you're more a part of the business than you are like an outside like legal advisor. Hope that
I
makes
like that.
sense.
Yeah, that does. I think what you did is you figured it out and how you can help businesses everywhere. What do you think is your like customer avatar? Who do you typically work with? Who is the best fit for your services to?
It's really like three camps right now. One of them is a startup that's scaling. It can either be like very traditional startup where like they're taking on investors, they're issuing equity, like hiring employees and they're not paying them, salary, but they're giving them equity. And those are like their like principal concerns.
Right.
Then there's other startups that like maybe they have more cash and all they're dealing with is like, we're just scaling. We just need to make sure that we don't get sued by our customers and that we're following the law. So that's kind of like the two different camps of startups. And that's, I would say, probably the main clients that I have. And then I have a couple clients that are more like pretty large businesses, like,
Mhm.
50 to 100 million a year revenue. And so they have like very different needs than somebody who's a startup because they've already kind of figured out a lot of those initial things. Like, I think once you pass like, what's the rule? Like once you pass like 3 million, you're like not a startup or something.
Yeah.
They've already gotten over a lot of those initial hurdles. And now it's really just about putting out fires. It's
Yeah.
like we're having this
Covering their
issue with
ass,
this
putting out fires.
employee.
Hmm.
Exactly. And those are the companies that are a lot, like you said, people will go after people with money. So those are the companies that are a lot more likely to get sued. So yeah, we just got this cease and desist letter. What do we do? How do we
Hmm.
make this problem go away? We have this employee who did this, that, and the other thing. And if we were to fire them, what's like the process of going through this? We want to make sure we do it, in a compliant manner. So they're just
Hmm.
dealing with a lot of different problems. There's a lot of different problems that occur at that level.
Yeah.
Um, and I like working with clients like that. They're obviously a lot harder to come by
Hmm.
because a business that's that size or they're not as common as somebody who's just starting up. So that I think I have less of those because it's not something that I like actively try to recruit.
Yeah. I think you can definitely find some of those guys because when they have a problem, they probably staying up at night and need someone to solve it. And you're just a professional problem solver at that point, right?
Yeah, that
You're on the
that's how I've
payroll.
definitely that's how I've definitely felt
Yeah.
a lot. It's like, oh, I'm literally just a professional problem solver. Because yeah, I mean, it's
That's
the
cool though.
the amount of problems that occur, and I have like it's kind of like cool that I have this insight. Like the amount of problems that businesses of those size face on a
Hmm.
daily basis are insane.
Yeah.
And then the businesses that are like in the billions, they
Hmm.
hire obviously the big firm downtown to do what I'm doing with a team of 50 people because I couldn't
Right.
do that as one person. So it gives you like context to
There's levels to it.
the the level, yeah, like the level of legal problems that a business will have based on how big they are.
Yeah.
And there
Cool.
typically is like a one-to-one. Like the more employees you have, the more liability, the more problems you're gonna have. Like it's a
Mm.
one-to-one. I mean, yeah, you have these companies that are like, we have like the perfect corporate culture and we don't have problems. I mean, those definitely exist, but I think in a large part, another thing too is like to manage. Let's say you have like 500 employees. Like
Right.
managing that is just insane.
It's a monster. Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
even know. I don't even know where to begin. That's when you're the big dogs. So keep things lean, fire everybody, use AI, right?
yeah. I mean, I feel like that's definitely the businesses of the future.
Yeah,
And I can guarantee and attest that they have less problems. So
right. It's wild. There's always going to be the human condition where people are crazy or having problems or fed up, or you never know what's going on with people. You know what I mean? So they might pick, and then they're going to pick their boss at their company or their job to take it out on for no reason. It's pretty wild. So
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Well, I think we're gonna not quite wrap it up, but is there any other like other thoughts like of just about that entrepreneurs don't know about setting up their business or law that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah. So I think if I were to give a piece of advice to every entrepreneur who's starting a new business, and you can do this with an attorney or you can not do this with an attorney, is try to think about all of the areas of risk, like a risk management. Try to think about all the areas of risk in your business. So, like if you're in the service-based business, what service am I providing to my client that could expose me to a lawsuit? So if I'm a marketing agency, maybe if I'm marketing on behalf of this business, I need to make sure that they own their intellectual property. Because if I start posting advertisements regarding intellectual property that's not actually owned by this business, the other business who actually owns that property can come and sue me. So that's like one example. If you're doing SaaS, software as a service, you want to make sure that your agreements with your customers don't overly represent what your software delivers. I mean, could you imagine having a contract and saying, our software has no bugs? I mean, you're almost guaranteed to have problems. So that's another area where like you want to think about, and obviously an attorney can help with this, but try to think, where are all the areas of risk that I have now in my business? Yeah. So I mean, that's one thing. And then in terms of what you can do kind of without an attorney is like we talked about earlier with the liability protection. Like make sure your LLC is set up the right way. You can do this on your own. I feel like if you're going to hire an attorney to do it, it's mostly to save time than it is anything else. Like save your time from having to research this and everything. So if you're first starting out and you don't have a lot of resources, do this yourself because you absolutely can. So that's an actionable step. And make sure that all your documents are correct. So like you have an operating agreement, which is that formal document that lays out, how your business is supposed to operate. Make sure you get a tax ID number. Make sure you have a separate bank account, and that you're not, like we talked about, mixing your personal assets with your business assets.
That's cool.
So that would be like the most important piece of advice that I would give to like the average person who's just starting, who maybe isn't even thinking about contracts or isn't even thinking about like, what is my client going to sue me over? For them, it's just like, hey, I need to set up the foundation of this thing, which is set up your LLC, have an operating agreement, set up, get your EIN, your tax ID with the IRS, make sure you have separate bank accounts and that you're not commingling your personal assets with your business assets. That's going to be like primary of what a judge is going to look at to be like, is this a real business or is this not a real business?
Well, thank you for coming on today, man. I still have some questions for you, but for everybody listening out there, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Yeah, so the best way to get in contact with me is honestly on LinkedIn. You could just look up Sebastian Garcia lawyer, and I think my LinkedIn should come up. Or you can email me at sebastian@founderscouncil.com. I don't know if we'll have that in the description because I know sometimes the spelling gets a little off. So you can look me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, or you can just shoot me an email. Like I said, I always like to lead with value. So if you want to jump on a call, have me take a look at something for you, be more than happy to do that as a means to connect.
Yeah, Sebastian has been a huge asset to our business, so I can basically vouch for him. He's a good, he does really good work. Cool. So I got 3 questions that I always ask everybody kind of at the end. We're going to kind of put you on the spot, but first one, I'm the money guy, right? We got the credit leverage X. We got to talk about money. So what is like one tip either that you've learned or that you would give somebody starting out that has like just helped you get rich, right? Or helped you get further ahead in life financially?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll give like the really basic advice, at least like what really helped me out when I started to actually make a little money is like really take inventory of what you spend your money on. Because there's probably a lot of stuff that you're spending your money on. You're probably spending your money on a lot of things that like don't actually bring you happiness and joy. And if that was something that you could leverage to gain personal freedom and security in your life, like that for me, whenever I think about like, and I'm very like OCD about this kind of stuff. Like if I'm going to spend money on something, I'm always like, is this going to give me more happiness than it would give me if I got an 8% return or a 15% return on this same money, and like what that brings to your life in terms of freedom? So I would implore people to like really, and this is just my take, like I would implore people to think about, what am I doing with my money and could it be better used to buy myself freedom? Like quit your 9 to 5, have more free time to do whatever it is that you want. Because in my opinion, having freedom over your time is like the best and most valuable thing over anything else, even being a multimillionaire or a billionaire. Like one thing they talk about is like time freedom or time wealth.
Yeah.
I would say that's very valuable.
And then the next question is basically about happiness. What tips have you found to live a happier life or to that might help somebody else, find a little bit more happiness?
Yeah. So I read this book about a year ago. It was called Dopamine Nation. And so what it basically talks about is like a lot of the things that we do. So a lot of the things we do to feel happy actually make us unhappy. And the reason why is because a lot of like, whether it's like eating a chocolate bar or like going and, buying like some expensive thing that you don't need. Like it triggers dopamine in your brain. And when you get that high, if you're doing this very often, what you're doing is you're creating this like elastic rubber band effect where the more you spike your dopamine, the more you dip. So people who are like, oh, I feel bad. Let me indulge in this like, immediate gratification. They're getting constant dopamine spikes and then they're like coming all the way down. So that's what creates this like, I'm happy, I'm unhappy, I'm happy, I'm unhappy. And a lot of that is really just chemical in your brain.
Mhm.
So if I were to give like an actionable step, it's like read that book and just simplify your life, like, you know, don't get super high, don't get super low, try to like stay even keel, and like learn to be happy in that middle ground because your life, your emotions become a lot more stable than like the high highs and the low lows.
I like it. Yeah, I've been researching happiness, and it's like if you just like are at a sense of peace or like an easy middle key, like you're talking about, like you're naturally happy. You're probably going to be naturally, but if you do like the roller coasters, that's what modern society definitely likes to get weird about and like overemphasize, like, oh, this is what your life needs to be, jet skis flying
Right.
around or whatever, whatever it is. Yeah, keep it easy. And then the final and third question is just like, what's one habit that you started doing, like actually doing that had an impact for the better on your life?
Yeah. Well, I think number one would be like the gym, like getting started in that when I
Yeah.
was when I was younger, like that really helped. But in terms of productivity, I would say like not to get, and I think a morning routine is really great and it's a luxury, like to be able to wake up and like, immediately get sunlight, drink a glass of water. I think that's incredibly important. But I also think like sometimes just kind of pounding that cup of coffee at like 5 a.m. and just getting to your desk and working for like 2 or 3 hours before anyone's bothering you. And I don't think that's sustainable necessarily to be done every single day because, sometimes doing that morning meditation is what you need and it is very, very important and it does contribute to your happiness. But I think making sure you do have some of those days where you just like pound the coffee and get to the desk and kind of put your head down, like that's a habit that you will like make, in 3 hours of like that morning deep work, fully focused, you'll get more done than people get done in a week. So
Wow.
my advice would be like to try to have some days like that in your week. It doesn't have to be every day, but at least two or three.
Love that. That was fire. Well, thank you so much for adding just like so much value to the show and to everybody out there listening. Be sure to reach out to Sebastian on LinkedIn and also check out his email. And if you need some legal advice or you're trying to get a business going, he is the man to call and get in contact with. Sebastian, do you have any like last thoughts or any last words you'd like to share with the audience?
I don't know. I mean, I think like based on everything that we talked about, like if you take anything away from this podcast, like maybe the last couple minutes is more important than the legal stuff, because at the end of the day, like you want to feel good, you want to be happy, and try to find like a scientific way to do that. If you want to move your life forward, sometimes you got to just like do the hard work first thing in the morning and be fully focused. And yeah, take inventory of what you're spending your money on and try to make sure it's going towards things that are going to like buy you freedom and buy you happiness.
I love it, man. I think that was fire. Well, thanks for everybody listening out there. Be sure to check out the next podcast where we have tons of value, and I'll look forward to talking to you in the next one. Peace out, everybody.
All righty.